Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Stazen. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Homelessness, and we are so happy to share with you the recording of a webinar that we did on partnering with people with lived experience. Truly partnering with people with lived experience is a really core value at IGH, and it's something that we bring into every aspect of the work that we do. And so we wanted to convene a panel of truly the experts in homelessness. And so you'll hear today from our moderator, Rob Robinson, who is a person with lived experience, and then a wonderful panel of really diverse speakers from Hawaii, from Australia, and from other parts of the world. And it's a really wonderful conversation that we hope you enjoy. So really pleased to introduce and hand it over to Rob Robinson, a formerly homeless community organizer and activist who is based in New York City. He has worked with social movements all around the world, including the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil, groups in South Africa, groups in Spain. And so he really brings a deep understanding of global homelessness. And so we thought he was a really wonderful person and partner to be moderating this conversation. So thank you again for watching this recording, and we hope that it inspires you in your work to partner even further with people with lived experience. Thank you. Over to you, Rob.
Work in different spaces like that, whether it be in the community, whether it be in academia, or whether it be along with policy and legal authorities. I've been blessed to work in all of those circles, and I hopefully left an impression on those folks. So my bio, as Lydia said, is as long, so I won't go into that, but I will share with you a little bit of my personal background. I'm formerly homeless, having spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter. And that experience was what I like to call a transformation. It changes the way I look at the world. It makes me recalculate things that I was thinking in the past. It made me rethink what I was taught in the past and said, the world exists different than it was taught to me in the first half of my life. And there was a statement that I made, a theoretical statement that I came up through my experiences. I think that opened the door for me to travel around the world, to work with organizations like IGH and others. And that was, gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. I want to repeat that. Gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. It seemed to me that there was a predetermined path for some people. And in the US, I would argue that it was mostly Black and brown or poor people, impoverished people, that was happening to. So how do you change it? Well, I think the way you change it is by changing narratives, right? So one of the things I've done, the reason why I came into this work is I said the narratives that everybody was painting about myself and others who went through this thing called homelessness, it's not necessarily true. There are generally 4 factors that they label you with, or they paint you with a broad brush in the US, and that is you're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. But let me look at those 4 points. I wasn't homeless because I didn't want to work. I started working when I was 9 years old with my dad, who was in the restaurant business. So I would go on Saturdays alongside of my dad. So I worked since I was 9 years old. I have a college degree, an undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland. Maryland is a state here in the US. Never diagnosed with mental illness, and that's no reason why we should discard people or mark them with a scarlet letter. And I don't have an alcohol or a chemical addiction. So I went on a journey to say, I have to change that narrative. And not only do I have to change it, I have to find other voices of people like me who have experienced the same thing as me and change that narrative, right? So the narrative in the US is to blame the individual. It's not an individual problem, it's a societal issue, right? We have poverty in the US, the wealthiest country in the world suffers from impoverished people. 1% in the United States controls 40% of the wealth. The other 60% of the wealth is fought over by 99% of us. That's just an equation that just doesn't work out, no matter how you try to spin it. So that is at the core of what we struggle with here in the US with respect to homelessness, and the answers haven't been the best, right? I'm somebody who spent some time in shelter, but I would argue that shelter doesn't end homelessness. It's a place to warehouse bodies. You're homeless because you don't have a home. So how do we house people? How do we permanently find places for people to stay? And how do we support people if they have mental illness or chemical addictions while at the same time housing them? You know, we used to have a model here in the US. The predominant model was, well, if you have a chemical or alcohol addiction, you have to get straight. You have to go in a program before we can house you. House the people first. There's a model, house them first and then bring the supportive services. It just makes so much sense. And the final point that I would make before I bring in the other speakers is, I think New York doesn't do a good job. I live in the city and I'm constantly pushing a rock up a hill. New York City spends 1.5 billion American dollars, 1.5, pull out your calculators, folks, and do the math, to support people who are staying in shelters on a given night. There are some 60,000 people on a given night that stay in 550 shelters in New York City. Just doesn't make sense. Those resources can be used a lot differently and provide permanent housing and permanent support for people. So that's a little brief introduction and sort of a scope of the US. I could go, well, I should say of New York, I could go across the country because I could go all the way to the West Coast, and there's some even bigger problems in California than there are in New York, of which I'm very much involved in. But I just, I appreciate organizations like Institute for Global Homelessness for promoting the voices of those of us that are directly affected. So with that, I'm going to bring in the speakers one by one and allow them to talk about 5 to 7 minutes about the work that they do and their own experiences and what their thoughts are with respect to bringing in the voices of those directly affected. I'm going to start off with Allan, Big Al Connolly, who is a community entrepreneur at heart and now a speaker, mentor, and learning leader in entrepreneurship in Perth, Australia, the country from down below. He is a founder managing director of Community HQ, a profit for purpose social business, building community wealth in Australia. Big Al, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Rob, what a wonderful opening, and absolutely you could have transposed that to probably most westernized countries. It's a system failure, and the time is now to hit that reset button. You know, it's not that it's the third world nations that are struggling with these kind of issues. It is first world nations that are actually perpetuating the problem. So how do we press that reset button? And I think it is by having this dialogue across states, across countries, across continents. Housing should be the right of all citizens of this world. It should be an inherent right to have a roof over your head. And even if, though we have some systemic problems and perpetuating, you know, born into poverty and those kind of things, we have to do better. We have to make sure that we're not just writing prescriptions for the symptoms. We have to make sure that housing is appropriate for everybody who is born into this world. And I do realize that that's quite maybe a flippant statement, especially when you consider the billions of people that, with many of them suffering from you know, lack of food. You know, if we can't even give them food, how are we going to give them, you know, housing? But we really do need to continue these conversations and to look at what it is that you know, is the driver in the economic systems that we have that prevents us from building that social and affordable housing. And right here in Western Australia right now, obviously the pandemic has hit everybody across the world, but Western Australia has created its own little bubble, possibly because we're one of the remotest capital cities in the world. And we do have a system here where we can close off our borders, even internally, so that we can restrict movement throughout the country. But the point I'm trying to get at here is we have a industry, resources industry that creates our economic platform. West Australians per capita are some of the wealthiest people in the world. So how is it that when we've got, even in our budget, a $5.6 billion windfall surplus, that we still have loneliness, poverty, and homelessness in this wealthy state? So it is a breakdown of democracy. It is a breakdown of our community values. I'm even going to just drop the religion bomb in there just a little bit as well. You know, at the end of the day, people come into this world as people, and they choose some of their pathways. They're born into some of it, but some of them then choose their other pathways. But their right to housing is a basic human right. And I think we just need to focus on those basic human rights and get that proper. That's called a foundation stone. If you put a foundation stone in, then all of these problems that are costing our governments multi-billions of dollars just to put a plaster on, it just doesn't seem right from an entrepreneurial point of view. And I think the challenge is the thinking. We need to think differently. We need to go, right, we've got capitalism at an all-time high with companies that have got revenues bigger than countries. And that extractive process of those companies means that they're sucking the lifeblood out of our localized communities, which means that we can't provide for ourselves, which means that we have this continuous dog-eat-dog situation where we have to look after ourselves. And that's not what we are as and supposed to be as the human race. The words charity come out of people's mouths, rolls off the tongue very easily nowadays. But a good friend of mine, Janine in Perth here, she said it's not charity, it's humanity. Let's get back to that humanity and actually caring about people. So I wasn't sure how I was going to start off my conversation today, but Rob, you know, you immediately created, you know, thought processes for me where I'm going, yes, 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 come on. Why can't we just have more of these conversations, join the dots, and start to utilize property the way that it's supposed to be utilized? And that's not necessarily for investment purposes, it's for people to live in. So thank you for the welcome. Thank you very much, Lydia, for asking me, and Julie for hosting me from Australia. And I look forward to hearing from the other speakers this morning.
Al, thank you so much for your comments. You touched on the economy and the C word, as I like to call it, capitalism. You know, I work a lot in academia, and sometimes I go into the community with academic thoughts and people push back on me. But I think we have to look at capitalism and what role it plays in our society and in our lives. And I would argue, and I hope our discussion will lead in this direction towards human rights, because I think they clash with one another, right? If you are a believer in human rights, then you got to step back from capitalism. Capitalism has to go if you're a strong believer in human rights, right? So I think those things are in direct conflict with one another, but we can talk about that as we go further. So thanks again for your comments. So our next speaker will be Lindsay Pacheco, who is a founder of Kepo Iokaka KPOC, a group of houseless people who self-organized in 2019 and began conducting weekly cleanups and other service projects. And the Kaka, also known as KPOC leaders, are now spearheading an effort to find land for Kalahu, affordable village-style housing to serve as permanent homes for people who remain houseless in urban Honolulu. Lindsay, it is an honor to bring you in. I have a good friend who is in Honolulu. I don't know if you know the name, Josh Cooper, one of the people who taught me all about human rights. He teaches at the University of Hawaii, and I will make sure to connect him with you, because I've always asked him, Josh, you got to connect me with people who are struggling around houselessness and homelessness in Hawaii. So now I'm going to get after him a little bit, and I'll make that connection afterwards. But thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Mahalo. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate it. It truly is an honor to be here. And to help with the spelling, it's Kapoe o Kaka'ako, which stands for the people of Kaka'ako, which is a location here in Honolulu, where I was part of a large homeless encampment for almost 8 years. We were an encampment of 120 people that, no matter what the government or the city and county did to us, we stuck together, we stayed together. You know, if we got chased out of someplace, we were moved together, and we literally stuck together. And let me tell you, our government thought of us as a pain in the butt. They called us and labeled us as the most resistant to change. Like, we didn't want, no, it's not that. What it is we were tired of having smoke blown up our rears, and you know, the inconsistencies that come from service providers. So I have actually been housed for almost 2 years now. I finally got housing in May of 2020. And you go ahead, Rob, give me that referral to your friend, because I am now a student of University of Hawaii. I'm actually at Honolulu Community College. I will be graduating this semester with my associates in liberal arts, but I'll be transferring over to the UH Manoa in the fall for my social work degree. With that all being said, now that I'm housed, I have the opportunity to go back out and help the rest of my, what I like to call ohana, which means family in Hawaiian. I like to go back out and advocate, educate, and push for the rights of our houseless folks, because here in Hawaii, our houseless folks, or we call them houseless, because in Hawaiian culture, the land is our home. So no matter where we are on this aina, on this land, we are home. So we're not without a home, we're just without four walls. Therefore, we're called houseless. So with that said, you know, I have the wonderful opportunity and privilege to continue fighting for those who are still out there on the streets, you know, and through the work that we do, and I'm sure he's going to speak right after me. Mr. James Koshiba is like my greatest mentor, actually. So normally we do these things hand in hand together, but I'm left to hang dry by myself right now, which is totally fine. But he is actually one of my greatest supporters and mentors in the work that I do. I've learned so much from him, because it's his organization that has come out to help us while we were still on the street and while our encampment was still an encampment. Since 2019, our encampment got dispersed, and it's a struggle to keep our community together, because we go by that community first model. I am also currently a housing first recipient for a housing voucher. That's how I got my housing. And yes, I honestly agree 100%. House people first, because I was not able to get clean and sober or back into college or get help to treat my depression until I got housed, because I no longer had that worry of are my things going to still be there when I get back. You know, I don't have that worry anymore. So therefore, yes, Now that I'm housed, I am able to get the help and services that I need. And life has been flourishing ever since. You know, and earlier James and I were talking about what are we going to talk about for this presentation? What main points are we going to push out there? So my 3 main points that I'd like to push out there coming from a lived experience perspective is trust, consistency, and honesty. Without those 3, coming from a service provider standpoint, you'll never be able to help a homeless person. You know what I mean? Because homeless people come from different levels of brokenness. You know what I mean? It's hard for us to trust people. It's hard for us to believe that if you're going to help us, how can I believe you? You know what I mean? How do I know that you're going to help me? Like you say, you're going to help me. That comes with the consistency. If service providers really want to help people, be consistent and stay consistent, you know, because without that consistency, there's no trust. You know what I mean? You need to have both. And, you know, with both in hand, and when I say honesty, it means honest feedback, honest, constructive criticism. You know, like I said, James here, Mr. James Koshiba is my greatest mentor. And throughout my whole process, he calls me on my stuff in the most constructive and helpful way, which only helps me as an individual be able to do better what I already do, you know, and continuing to help support those who are struggling out on the streets, you know, to continue lifting them up, you know, continue getting them the services that they need. I mean, I'm not no like official recognized a paid service provider. I do this all for love, out of the love of my heart. And I always say, if you love what you do, it's never work. So this is not work. This is what I do for love. I love doing what I do. I love being able to be part of talks like this, you know, to share more awareness, to spread more education, like, you know, because here in Hawaii, somebody mentioned criminalization, and here in Hawaii, it has become criminal to be homeless out on the street. And that really is an ouch, because of a lot of our people struggle with being able to get into housing, but can't because of that criminal background that has now been established because of being homeless. You know, some people never had a record until they become homeless. Now they have a record. Now they have to deal with that, trying to get into a place. It's hard. So, I mean, the struggle is real. The struggle is everywhere. And I think the more that we can get together in groups like this and work together as a team, change will happen. This is the year, these next few years, I feel it in my gut, are the years for change and powerful movements. And you know what? It all starts with us. That's simply said. I mean, I can't say much more other than it starts with us. So I'm really happy and honored to be here. Thank you so much, everyone. And it's a pleasure to meet you all.
Lindsay, congratulations on your place. I know that struggle. I've lived it. I hear the passion in your voice, and it's wonderful to meet somebody with lived experience on the islands now. So Josh is going to have some work to do. I will make that direct connection because I've been bugging him for a longest time, right? But I just appreciate your views. Everything you had to say. Obviously, the passion is coming out in you. And I share a lot about the service provider perspective that you presented. I spent 13 years in New York on the continuum of care, which oversees in New York about $100 to $150 million in McKinney-Vento funding that comes into New York City. And for 12 of those 13 years, I was one of 27 people that oversaw the administration and distribution of that money. So it was a pretty powerful position. And I could challenge with those critical analysis and force people to do things in a different way, because we worked as a collective. All of the folks who were homeless or formerly homeless, we were 1/3 of the voting voices in that group. So it's powerful when the voices of people directly affected have not only a seat at the table, as we like to say, you're not on the menu, you're part of the discussion, right? Yeah. We can have a seat at the table, but is your seat on the table meaning you're on the menu? They're about to chop you up? That's the way we frame it here in New York. So there's a little way to go about, but thank you again so much for your comments.
I'm going to use that one now.
There you go. Feel free.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is the co-founder of Huey Aloha, which demonstrates how building community with those who are marginalized is key to solving some of our most persistent social problems, including homelessness. James Koshiba, Lindsay put you up on a pedestal, man. You got to come big, bro. The floor is
Oh
yours.
man, I don't know if I can meet that standard. Thank you, Rob. And as you all can tell, Lindsay is a powerful voice and leader, and she's one of my inspirations and teachers. So everything you said, Lindsay, back at you. As Rob said, my name is James Koshiba. I'm one of the founders of a group called Hui Aloha. And in the Native Hawaiian language, Hui means a group. It's a noun, it means a group, but can also be a verb, to hui up, to gather up and concentrate our energy and our power. And aloha, as you may know, its kind of literal simplest translation in the Hawaiian language is as love or connection. But it has, like many Hawaiian words, it has a much deeper meaning. Most Hawaiian words have at least two meanings and one kind of more subtle underlying meaning. And one interpretation of aloha is oneness, a sense of the connectedness of all things and all people. And that's the interpretation that we use. So Hui Aloha is the name of the organization, and it's an entirely volunteer-run nonprofit. It's a network of people across Oahu. And I'll share a little bit about our work in a second, but what I want to do is provide a little bit of context about Hawaii. And both Lindsay and Rob touched on this in their remarks. Hawaii has, for the last decade, had among the highest rates of homelessness per capita of any state in the country. I think in 7 of the last 10 years, we were number one. We also have the largest gap between average wages and the cost of housing of any state in the United States. We're very dependent on tourism as our primary driver of employment. That means we have a lot of service jobs, retail jobs, minimum wage, and shift work. And so that creates this gap between what people can earn and the cost of housing. And then the last piece of context I would share, sort of economic and policy-wise, is what Lindsay pointed to, and that is that we also have some of the most punitive laws in terms of criminalizing homelessness and poverty of any jurisdiction in the country. So it's illegal to sit down or lie on sidewalks in most parts of urban Honolulu. It's illegal to be in parks after hours. And those often carry a mandatory court appearance. And if you miss a court appearance, then that's a bench warrant for arrest and jail time. And so that's the context that we're operating in. Now, the thing that Hawaii has going for it is we also have a solid foundation laid by our indigenous population here of a culture of aloha. So the last, community, a sense of community spirit, that sense of extended family that Lindsay talked about, ohana, is alive and well in Hawaii. The last person in my family to be homeless was my great-grandfather, who in 1890 ran away from the sugar plantations here. He was a homeless immigrant teenage boy. He had no place to go. He was adopted off the streets of Maui by a Native Hawaiian family. Couldn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, but he lived with them for 10 years. He was what we call hanai. It's an informal adoption. And he didn't leave them until he was 25 years old, which is when he met my great-grandma. And that's how our family starts in Hawaii. But that spirit of taking people in and caring for people across boundaries of race and culture and language still exists in Hawaii. It's not reflected in our policies or in our economics, but that culture is still here, and that's something to build off of. And that's sort of where the heart of Hui Aloha comes from. So my journey in learning about this and working on this issue is, I come from, I'm a policy wonk by training. I've worked in NGOs and nonprofits, but in 2015, I left my job running an environmental nonprofit, and I wanted to learn more about homelessness. The first place I reached out to was other people in the nonprofit realm. And it became clear to me right off the bat that there was a disconnect between what the service providers, their priorities, and what I imagined people on the street were experiencing. And that's not the fault of the service providers. It's because unlike New York City at the time, the policy was being driven and the contracts are being written and the performance outcomes are being drafted by people that had no connection to people on the street. And so the main measure of success for outreach was get people off the street, especially if housed people are complaining in this area, and get them into shelters quickly. And what happened after that was, who knows? But that's what was driving the providers. And I realized the only way to really learn about the issue would be to build some relationships on the street. So I pitched a tent in the area that Lindsay used to live, Kaka'ako. It was a huge encampment at that time. It was actually even bigger than when Lindsay was living there. There's about 400 people living in Kaka'ako. I pitched a tent on a block there, and I stayed for long enough to build some relationships and some trust with people. And what I learned was a couple of really important lessons. One is that the punitive criminalization of homelessness really does a lot to disrupt people and set their lives back. In that block that I moved into, there was actually quite a strong sense of community. There was some leadership. People were cooperating to do things like haul in water from the park, to haul trash to dumpsters so it wouldn't collect on sidewalks. But when the city stepped in and started to sweep in other areas and push people toward our encampment, it disrupted all of that. And that's when things got, when the neighborhood complaints started to spike about trash and noise. It was because actually the city's policy had created an unstable situation. And the second thing I learned was that in every encampment, and this has held true in the years since creating Kuialoha, in every encampment, there are people who are trying to do something positive there, who are resources for other people in their encampment, who are cleaning the park bathroom themselves on a daily basis. And so what Kuialoha learned and has tried to implement from those lessons is we go out as a volunteer team, we connect the people on the street like Lindsay, we try to find those people who are resource people, who are leaders in their encampment, and we try to partner with them. And often that turns into kind of a weekly service project anchored by people in that encampment, a weekly cleanup of the park or repainting the park bathrooms. And we support them in that. And as that work grows, what it does is it attracts housed supporters. That might just be neighbors in that community. It might be an elected official that takes notice. Lindsay started showing up at city council meetings and what we call neighborhood board meetings or quasi-governmental bodies. And her presence there was revolutionary. It blew people's minds. It destroyed stereotypes, and it shifted people's attitudes towards houseless folks in that neighborhood and made new solutions possible. So that's kind of the model. And I'll just finish with a couple of quick last thoughts. One is Rob raised this question of, what does it mean to be home? And I think home requires two things. One is it requires space without artificial time limits and constraints, space that gives you time to heal and grow in the ways that you need to. And along with that space has to come community, a sense of caring relationships and belonging. If we don't have those two things, we're not home, right? And in a place like Hawaii, where competition for space is fierce and typically goes to the highest bidder, we need to get really creative about how to create those spaces for folks. I'll finish with this, and again, this is a lesson I learned from watching Lindsay in action, but there's a direct correlation between the amount of physical space that we make available for folks as a community and the amount of space in people's hearts and minds for people experiencing homelessness. And so that changing hearts and minds is part of the battle. And that's where having people with lived experience, not just at the table, as Rob said, but at the center of the conversation with real voice and real power in those conversations is the game changer. So mahalo, thank you.
James, thank you for your comments. Very inspiring, and you were up to the task. We challenge you to follow Lindsay, and you did a great job. I just love the perspectives and your journey from a policy wonk or where you were, trying to understand by embedding yourself in that community. I think that is so powerful, right? And this idea of doing work on a voluntary basis is something I subscribe to. I don't like the model of not-for-profit organizations in the US and the philanthropic models that decide on the work that's being done and people taking checks just because they need resources. I get that. I'm not against you having resources, but the work should be done by community decision, right? What the community says needs to be done. And we need to figure out that way why communities making decisions, not philanthropic organizations. I think the other thing that you touched on is, I was always challenged with this houseless and homeless conversation, but I think yours and Lindsay's way of explaining it did a great job for me, because I don't want to say I bump heads with my comrades in San Francisco and on the West Coast, but they use the term and we use it differently. And I think it laid it out, but the way you guys explained it, I think just it resonates with me. So I'm a little more comfortable now using it, and I totally get it, and I'm appreciative of that. Before I introduce the final speaker, I want to, and I think this is a great segue. I spent a lot of time working in Brazil, and it was the MST who reached out to myself when I was doing the work of Take Back the Land, because I was talking about changing a fundamental relationship to land. My argument was that land as a commodity doesn't work, right? It's just not going to work for us, right? So how can we common land? How can we provide land for everybody? Because if you had access to land, you had access to a stable life. Well, Brazil's constitution says land has to serve a social function. It has to be growing food or providing housing. Very simple. So the MST started moving at night instead of traveling to and from work 2 and 3 hours every day to pass an open swaths of land. Let's move in on that land and start to grow food, and then stake claim to that land. And then when daylight comes, take bamboo and build an abode. Before you know it, they're fighting for title. So I think what is happening in Brazil and the things I've learned from other social movements around the world around this issue is really valuable. And this whole thing about community is just incredible. I think that's central to it. Raquel Rolnick, who was from Brazil and a former UN Special Rapporteur, she came to the US in 2009, and we created a documentary film called More Than a Roof. And she was in an indigenous community in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And one of the things she said is, a house is more than a roof, right? And it's a sense of community, all the things that you laid out, James. So it was just retracing that back for me, something she said 12 years ago, and here it comes again. So I just appreciate your comments and everybody's comments that preceded. So our final speaker is Alicia Vázquez Silvera, a member of the Colectivo Ni Toda Está Perdido, also known as NITEP, in Montevideo, Uruguay, a group of houseless people, in addition to students, teachers, and community members, working to advocate for the rights of people experiencing homelessness across Uruguay. Alicia, welcome. Latin America is in my heart, as you heard from me.
Muchas gracias. ¿Se escucha?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Sí, estoy en un colectivo.
I'm in a collective.
Bueno, ya empecé a ponerme nerviosa.
And now I'm getting nervous.
Estoy en un colectivo.
I'm in a collective
Tratamos con gente en situaciones.
where with people that live on the streets.
Bueno,
Well,
yo después le voy a
after
mi compañero va a explicar
my colleagues will be able to explain better than I can on the projects that we're working on, then that is very important as well. Well,
no vine a contar mi historia de
but since I came to tell you my story,
creo que me es más fácil.
I think it's easier.
Estoy muy nerviosa.
I'm very nervous, very nervous.
Estaba en las Naciones Unidas.
And even more than when I went to the UN.
Bueno, agradecerles
Yeah, I would appreciate
a
Lydia, who contacted me to be with all these beautiful people. Well, what can I tell you? Thank you to the social services university that's helping me, and it's helping me again. And so then I'll start with the subject matter of my life. It was hard. I'm going to sum it up since I was very little. So it's hard to tell this story. Now I'm going to start when my parents, I'll start off when my parents passed away. I was fine. I had a car. I had my own home and in conjunction with my parents until my mother got sick with Alzheimer's. And my dad had nothing. My dad passed away first. On August 23rd of 2011, in less than 5 months, my mom passed away. She passed away in January of 2012. I hadn't finished up with my grieving when I started another one. I had a brother that wanted to sell the house and that everybody wanted the money, the money, the money. She's saying money in cash in English. And turned out that all the siblings we fought amongst ourselves. Everybody wanted the money. Everybody turned their backs on me. I had a lot of girlfriends as long as I had money again in English. The money finished. And I helped people because I had a good heart, and they never returned it. And I ended up in on the streets. First, I went to Mides, and then from there to Puerta de Entrada. And at Puerta de Entrada, they made me wait tons of hours. I was hungry. I was cold, thirsty, no money in my pocket. I ate where you throw out the trash in the trash cans. The big trash cans where people throw out food. I was hungry and I ate in the streets. And then they sent me to a shelter. There were all kinds of women, 30 women. And the 30 women, they were all very different with psychiatric pathologies. I think I was the only sane one there and the only one that was okay up here until they sent her to a psychiatrist, because if not, I couldn't gain entrance. I was hunger. I went through hunger, cold. The schedule or the hours, it was from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 9 in the morning. And then they would kick you out, and all day on the streets. It could rain. Lots of times we would come here to the social sciences college. They would give us water and eat something. And then at 6 o'clock, we would go back. We had to shower or bathe, thankfully. After so many hours in the street of bathing, it was super enjoyable. They would feed us dinner. The following day, we had to be in bed by 10 o'clock, laying down. Yeah, almost everybody was taking medication. I was the only one that wasn't on medication. And I started taking pills given to me by a psychiatrist. And I always saw that shelter is just to kind of go in and out because you have nowhere else to go. I couldn't find a job. And I left, and I was taking care of cars. They gave me a couple of pesos, like when people park their cars, like she was taking care of them to make sure there was no violence, is what she's referring to. And since previously I had a car, I would I would run away so I wouldn't have to give a coin to the person that would take care of the cars in the car park. And that's when I realized that life, I never ate leftovers when I was at home, and I would fight with my dad about it. I don't want this food. It's old. I'm not going to eat this. I was very snobby until I had to eat from the trash cans. When I left, someone's telling her to hurry up. When I stopped eating from the trash cans on the street, I started asking for coins on the street. I would ask for food or beg for food. And it turned out a lady, more or less of my same age, even though I feel like I'm a girl at heart. She was my same age, and she told me, let's go to this place. It's a place where you can learn theater, movies. I said, okay, all right. And Walter Ferreira was there. He's the coordinator for Urbanos. And I saw a bunch of people that were meeting up, and I asked him, what is it? And he said, it's the collective NITEP. I'm going to sit down, I thought. And next to my colleague that's here now. And he started explaining to me what the collective was all about. Help people that are on the streets. They help you. For example, they had meetings every Friday. They get you jobs. And they get, how do you call it? Donations. They request donations for clothing, shoes. We would put on popular plays. And that's the part that I lived in NITEP. Currently, nowadays, sorry, it's much more advanced, everyone. And I'm happy about that. I don't know. I don't know how they did it, but they're way up high. Everybody knows about them. When I was at Urbano, I went back again. When I go back to Urbano, from the Colectivo NITEP, they start saying, well, a person is going to Chile, another one to Argentina. They get together in groups until they vote for me to go to New York, to the United Nations. I couldn't believe it. I had never been on a plane. I went on 4 planes. I couldn't even believe it. I can't keep up with that. I was 10 years ago. There's a subject that I left the streets to a shelter. Yeah, and a surprise I have for Lydia when I got in contact with her. It's horrible when I'm living. I'm not at the shelter anymore. I got a job. I'm at a pension or a lower or a motel. I make 1,900 pesos, but now I want to go to an apartment because I want to continue to grow and giving more, getting out of the bottom that I still have issues. I don't deny it. I still take the psychiatrist pill, but I'm with a psychologist now, and he's helping me too. So not to have those downs, depressive downs. I have a partner, and he would drink. Yeah, he wasn't good for me because he would make me consume and be more depressed. So I opened up. In Spanish, we say it's better to be alone than in bad company. I'm coming up. I'm rising. Oh my God, she said in English. I'm very happy about this. The collective really helped me a whole bunch. They've given me good advice, and they continue helping and giving advice to other street people. For me, it's very important to feel this way, that I can be useful to them. I know Alicia traveled and Alicia moved forward. She's still working. She's still giving. And for that, I'm proud of that. And to be in the NITEP collective. So then I'm rising little by little. I'm sorry, I look so terrible. There was a bad wind. But I feel a lot of trust with Lydia. We've connected well through WhatsApp. I have the 3 vaccines. I don't have COVID and I'm not getting it. Good luck to everyone. Yeah, the streets are just one step, just one step. Thank you to all of you. A million thanks for the opportunity to meet these wonderful people. And thank you to the NITEP collective. There's my t-shirt on.
Alicia, thank you.
Alicia, gracias.
Your story is powerful. I understand the emotion, but you will be less nervous the more you talk about your situation. I can tell you that from experience. I've been sharing my story for 15 years, and it gets easier and easier every day that you do it. And you shouldn't be ashamed of your story, because it is a powerful story that makes change, right? So if I could change one person's life with my story, I'm always willing to do it, and you should feel the same. Thank you so much for sharing. A very powerful story, and we appreciate you being in the space. So with that, folks, thank you everybody for your comments. I have a couple of questions, but I want to be cognizant of time. So I'm going to throw a couple of the questions out to the group to just answer the way you want. But I would just like to have short, concise answers if you could. And the first question I'm going to give is, how do organizations create meaningful opportunities to partner with people of lived experience in designing policies and programs, right? What is the methodology? We heard Alicia talk about NITEP, and we heard everybody else talk about the different organizations. So I'll leave it up to anybody who wants to answer that question. Just take a shot at it. Just turn on your microphone and answer it if you're up for it.
I would go back to what Lindsay said about trust, consistency, and honesty. And for us, that means, the initial reaching out has to be not with an agenda, not with,
That's right.
you have a goal for that person. It's just to build a relationship and connection. And that has to happen more than once. You got to come back, again and
That's right.
again, to that consistency to build that trust and that relationship. And once that trust is there, then a lot becomes possible. It becomes possible to advocate with versus advocate for, and to take responsibility with versus take responsibility for. And I think that's on the provider and outreach side, maybe that's a kind of shift in mindset that we all got to embrace.
That's right. James, I really appreciate that perspective. In 2009, I was fortunate to travel to Hungary. I was one of 4 people from a group in New York called Picture the Homeless. And one of the experiences I had was visiting with homeless people who lived in a forest that they called Sherwood Forest. And 3 times a week, social workers would come to that forest to have conversations with those folks. And they built the relationship and trust that you're referring to. And after living in that forest for some of them as long as 6 years, they all ended up housed because there was trust that was built over a period of time. And it wasn't parachuting in and parachuting out, right? Like, let me see what I can extract from this group of people and get my high grade in school or whatever. But these social workers were genuine in their approach, and you could see the relationship building over time. So thank you for
Right
that
on.
perspective. Anybody else have any thoughts on how they can use people like us with lived experience to create meaningful opportunities to partner with people? We're all part of an organization that is doing it right now, right? I gave the props to IGH, right? And I think we all did in our own little way, right? So, we have proof of it in front of us. Allan, looks like you want to make a comment?
Thanks, Rob. And it's just to ask, sometimes we come from a feeling of inferiority, having lived experience, and sometimes it's not that we feel that, it's actually that's put upon us. So, you're of a lower socioeconomic label, and if you live to that label, you will be lower socioeconomic. But at the same time, if you start to just, and this is hard, okay, you start to challenge those who think they're leading into having a conversation with you, and more than one conversation.
That's right.
And this kind of change takes time. It isn't done overnight. It's 15 years, you said you've been doing this now, Rob. There's still record loneliness, poverty, and homelessness in this world. So I talked about capitalism being at an all-time high, but socialism is at an all-time low. So we need both parties, capitalists and socialists, to come together and to use maybe capitalist principles to lift socialism, because capitalists, by the mere nature, are not going to keep pouring money into black holes. So if you want to engage with these organizations, don't go cap in hand, go with a solution, go with an opportunity for them to think differently.
Thank you, Al. That was a great perspective. So I'm gonna, again, I want to be cognizant of time, so I'm gonna jump to another question. So maybe if you all could outline some of the steps that leaders can take to make their organizations or governments more equitable and inclusive. That's a real powerful question, right? Because as Al just laid out, some of us have been doing this work for so long, and it can wear on you, right? I've seen leaders in this work walk away. I've had people, mentors of mine, tell me, I can't do it anymore, Rob. I just can't do it. I got to walk away, right? But then how do we make sure that the work that people are doing, the leaders are being genuine and impactful in the work that they do? And how do we push them in a direction to make sure that their organizations are inclusive? And again, I'll leave it up to anybody who wants to respond to that. Any thoughts? I know it's a loaded question, but go ahead, Al.
You know, every conversation that I have with the community sector normally revolves around the F word at some point, funding. Now, I know I'm different, and I know that my experience of lived experience is different. You know, I wasn't street present for too long, and my determination from thinking differently is what got me back into, and I'm going to call it the rat race, because it is. You know, you just keep pedaling, but grassroots movements, and somebody earlier talked about movements. Movements change the thinking that change the world. So joining up the dots, us all keeping in contact with each other, us all saying that whilst it's difficult, it's worthwhile. So, you know, start to look at that capitalism, socialism type of thing. So maybe opening up a coffee shop that you know, services the homeless and treats them with, if they're street present, treats them with dignity, but also allows the community, who quite often want to help, but they're misguided in thinking, well, I'm not going to give that person some money because they're going to spend it on drugs or alcohol. Look, it's their choice what they spend it on to survive. It's not a choice that's made, you know, with excess. You know, that is their survival mechanism. But if we could do it in a way where people go to a bar or a coffee shop or a cafe and get a fair exchange for their money, but that money's used to lift our you know, our impoverished. So that's me talking from an entrepreneurial point of view, and I know that's different, but I think we need to use capitalism to lift socialism.
So Al, I think you know, we shouldn't shut out any perspectives, whether we disagree with them or not. I think the idea is to come to consensus, what you were leading to, and that means we have to communicate with one another. I'm known in New York for saying, let's put it on the table and chop it up, right? We could sit behind a wall and throw dirt bombs at one another and get nowhere. But when we come in a room and we put it out on the table, we seem to find a way to work through our different issues. So I'm in big favor of that. Okay, so here's my final question, and I would like everybody to answer this question, if you don't mind. And I'm going to start off with Alicia. So Alicia, I want you to be prepared. What does the human right to housing mean to you? And just 1 minute, briefly, just tell me what the human right to housing means to you.
What is it? What is it for me as a human right? Everything. It's living, it's happiness, it's peace of mind, it's comfort. I'm a little straight-laced. I like to have my things. She's giggling. It's everything. A home is everything, in my way of thinking, right? You have your things. You have your house. You have everything. You can't have anything in the street or the motel. You can't have anything. Am I explaining myself?
Yes, perfect. That's fine. I wanted it in your own
Perfectamente.
words, and you've explained it well. Thank you. Al, I'm just going to call out names as I go across the screen. What does the human right to housing mean to you?
How can you top that from Alicia? But there is an addition to that human right. It's the means to be able to support that home, and job creation has to sit side by side, or meaningful work has to sit side by side with having a home. So it does mean everything. It's very hard to get a job if you don't have a home. So housing has to be first.
Thank you. Lindsay, you're next on my screen, but I'm going to bring you last because I want you to bring us home. You come powerful. So James.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would echo what others have said. Every one of us has a need to be home, to be at home somewhere. And that is a basic right. It should not be dependent on having money. And to flip that on its head, we should not be denying people being home because they don't have enough money to afford it wherever we are.
Thank you. All right, Lindsay, bring us home.
Well, first I was going to tell you, it's just 2 words: security and stability. But if you really want me to bring it home, in the eyes and the feelings of Native Hawaiian people here in Hawaii, our local Native Hawaiian people are outpriced from being able to afford a home here. So our Native people have to leave the only place they know is home to be able to afford some place to call home. And that means elsewhere in the world, leaving our islands. And that's not fair. So a basic human right that everybody deserves a home. Our local people deserve to live here at home where they belong, not where they are forced to live. And that goes for anybody that is indigenous to any land. You should never be displaced because your government or your state or your system wants to outprice you. That's just not fair. So for me, that right means I have a right to live in Hawaii. I am Native Hawaiian. I have a right to my aina. I have a right to my land. I have a right to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I knew you would bring it powerful with a lot of emotion. It's okay to cry, let it out, man. Ain't nothing wrong with that.
No shame in crying.
You're keeping it real. That's
Exactly.
what we love. Keep it real. So I'm just going to give a couple of closing words before I turn it back over to Lydia to close us out. This has been powerful for me. I want to thank IGH because, sometimes a person like me who's been fortunate enough to travel all over the world, you think you've heard it all, but I heard some powerful voices tonight that I know I need to stay connected to. And one thing I love to do, people always ask me, how do you know all these people all over the world? Because once I touch you, we stay connected. So that connective tissue is going to stay. I appreciate all that IGH did to bring us together. I appreciate all of you and the work that you were doing. And I kid you not, folks who know me know you're going to get an email from me. I'm going to continue to reach out. I will bug Lydia and everybody to give me all the contact information. Lindsay, I have yours. You put in the chat, but we will continue to talk. Again, I'm grateful to everybody at IGH for bringing us all together. Grateful to all of you for the work that you do, and grateful to everybody who participated, who listened in this webinar. Thank you all, and I hope we help present a view of homeless folks that is a little bit different than the one that you were being fed by the bigger portion of society tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lydia to close us out.
Well, I have really nothing more to say but to thank all of you for sharing your deep expertise on homelessness. At IGH, we believe what all of you have reiterated over the whole program tonight, that we will not solve homelessness until people who are experiencing homelessness or people who are unhoused are at the center and are leading these movements. And so we hope at IGH that we can take more and more and more of a backseat so that you all can be the true leaders in the work. And so, you know, this program of ours is just one step in that direction. We thank all of you for your engagement and your partnership with IGH. Lindsay, congratulations on the degree. Alicia, congratulations on the job. And congratulations, you know, to Al and James and Rob for your continued tireless advocacy for people who are homeless. So I hope this is the first of many international conversations about lived experience. We'll be following up with each of you. Maybe it's a continued series of conversations and ways of talking together, because we are more the same than we are different. I was thinking about, you know, Alicia having to sit with the therapists when nothing was wrong mentally, and Rob had a similar experience. Who would think that a woman from Uruguay and a man in Miami would have a similar experience, but there it is. And so, you know, these conversations and connections are how we push progress internationally so that all of our global neighbors have a home. So thank you also to my colleagues, Julia and Tiffany, for working so hard behind the scenes. There's lots of work that goes into something like that. So wanted to shout out. Also, huge thank you to Carol for providing our excellent Spanish translation today. A really important function for us in our international conversations. So
Carol, thank you.
thank you. Please follow along IGH on all the social media. We will be posting this recording on our YouTube page within the next couple of days so that you can continue to share it with all of our colleagues in all of our time zones around the world. So thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Aloha.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Take care.